I think deconstruction is one of the greatest challenges to the Christian faith right now, and the reason for
Mm.
that is because some people might think, "Oh, it's atheism, or it's progressive Christianity, or it's this or that," and those are certainly intellectual challenges to Christianity, but they're different destinations. Whereas deconstruction is the vehicle that takes people away from historic Christianity and into so could be they could land anywhere in the new age or atheism or as agnosticism. And so I think that because it's really a methodology that takes you away from the historic faith, I think it's a really timely issue. I think
So
deconstruction.
I want to point out two things here. Number one, it does strike me
Mhm.
that for, and this has been a critique of mine for a long time with people in these spaces, that a lot of them have no problem hanging out with like Christian nationalist adjacent folks. Like, for example, Elisa is doing an event with Frank Turek, which is being promoted right now on her Instagram. And Frank Turek is someone who attends Turning Point USA events. He speaks from the stage there. And as I've documented, Turning Point USA has no problem dealing in like blatantly and openly racist talking points like the Great Replacement theory. So for her and for this crowd, that's not really the biggest threat. The biggest threat to, and Sean does say the word Christianity later on in the clips, the biggest threat to Christianity is quote unquote deconstruction, presumably because it leads people away from the historic faith or historic Christianity, and also because it can lead people into places that are not Christian at all. One last point on this, and I'll hand it over to you. I have talked to Elisa before, and she has told me things like, well, what, the gospel is the death and resurrection of Jesus and the belief of forgiveness of sins. But the reason why I don't actually believe her when she says that is because then what she'll do is she'll say, well, if you're queer affirming or if you have this other view that's more progressive, that's not a true gospel. I mean, I have clips of her saying this. So
Mhm.
people will tend to get down to that very base level of, well, the resurrection. And then when I say, well, I agree with that, but also I have these other views, suddenly it shifts to, well, that's not historic Christianity. So I'm just kind of curious for you, like what your thoughts are on a clip like this when it comes to these
Yeah, I
claims.
mean, that's why on that last point, I think it's very important because historic Christianity is tied to biblical authority. But again, I want to stress it's a biblical authority of a particular type. I would call it very simplistic Protestantism. The
Mm,
Protestant tradition is actually very sophisticated. I disagree with a lot of it, but the Protestant tradition is very sophisticated when it comes to the nature of Scripture.
mm.
And you've got, dyed-in-the-wool Calvinists like B.B. Warfield and Archibald Alexander Hodge from the 19th century who are defending Scripture, but also absolutely recognize the problems in Scripture. They go so far as to say there are even errors here because we have to let people talk in their human way, right? So I'm not trashing Protestantism when I say that, but when it gets filtered down to the, let's say, to non-academic settings, and I don't mean that to sound elitist, I'm just trying to describe something. When you bring that down to a lower level, it becomes a lot more simplistic and it can get you into some trouble. That's why I'm
Yeah.
saying biblical authority is itself a topic of vigorous theological discussion. Like, what does that actually mean? How does it work? And what responsibility do we have to even engage Scripture, even again, taking a page out of Judaism, to even interrogate Scripture at times, because it may not actually sit well with who we are and the issues we have to deal with. Now, of course, the response to that will be, and I get this completely, where you're just picking and choosing. No, I'm discerning is really what it comes down to. That's
Mm.
the theological task, is to discern, and this is what the church has always done since the very beginning. Paul did it. It's just this is not that unusual. And can I a couple other things as I'm thinking about this, Tim, if you don't mind.
Fire
Um,
away.
I think I agree with them on one very important point. This is a point of commonality. I see people on social media using deconstruction in ways that I think are almost self-aggrandizing.
Mm.
And it becomes sort of like, I'm deconstructing, man. Hey, how's it going? Yeah, and I don't believe any stuff anymore. Isn't it great? And I'm thinking, that's not what deconstruction is. We have to do better than that. Deconstruction is actually not doing any of that stuff. And they even allude to this at one point in one of their videos. It's painful.
Hmm.
It's frightening. It's something that happens to you. You're minding your own business, and all of a sudden you have a life experience, or you read something, or you meet people, And this thing, whatever it is that you've always believed is absolutely central, let's say only people who confess Jesus with their lips avoid hell. And then you start meeting people who, which is, this has happened to me too, who challenge that point of view, not by arguing, but by their very existence.
Right.
And then you sit there, as I have, and said, oh, crap. I've got this thing inside of me. I don't want to face it. I don't want to go there. I'm really happy where I am. But after a time, it just doesn't let you anymore. And you have to face it and not fight against it, but let that voice speak. That is
Mm.
very important. And to me, that is not just to me, that is what deconstruction is. When people are saying, yeah, I don't believe that stuff anymore, I think this is garbage, they're actually reconstructing at that point. They're
Mm.
reconstructing in certain ways, but they're not deconstructing. Deconstructing happens to us. It can be frightening, it can be unsettling, it can be the loneliest place in the world.
Yeah.
And that's why I take issue with some of this rhetoric about deconstruction being, you know, the most threatening thing to the historic Christian faith. I just want to say, read some Psalms for people who are deconstructing. Read
Mm.
Psalm 73. I know how this used to go. I know what the rules are, but you know what? I don't see it anymore. I see the world around me that's nothing at all like what I was taught, you know, in Hebrew school or whatever. You know, you
Right.
have Job who's doing great, you know, and all of a sudden everything's taken away and he's questioning his own existence. He's questioning God's goodness and judgment. You know, this is part of the tradition itself. This is part of the genius of both the Jewish and Christian traditions, that we have what I would call deconstruction built into this system.
Mm.
But it's not the way a lot of people use it. And I think what Elisa and Sean and what Tim are doing is they have their sights on, uh, I think, people who probably should be critiqued.
Mm.
In my opinion, not maybe we wouldn't agree with all the people, but some of them are like a little bit, you know, unguarded, in my opinion.
Sure.
But that doesn't take away from the reality of we have to process our faith. We sometimes have to walk away from things and maybe come back in a different way. Well, you're not guaranteed how are you going to come back. No, you're not guaranteed how are you going to come back. That's part of life as well. But
Mm.
the answer to that is not just doubling down on biblical authority or so-called historic Christianity and saying if you don't follow that, you're actually you're giving voice to the doctrine of demons, as we've also seen in these videos.
Yeah. No, that's a great point.